Right, we now come to the defence statement. I call the Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on Ukraine, but first, may I reflect on the dreadful news last week of the death of Royal Naval pilot Lieutenant Rodri Lation. And on behalf of this House, I want to pay tribute to him. He was a consummate professional to his colleagues. He was dearly loved by his family. He'll be sorely missed by so many, and the thoughts of this House are with them today. Mr. Speaker, it's now been 930 days since Putin launched his full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. 930 days in which Ukrainian forces have fought heroically, while also communities have endured relentless attacks, children have been stolen to Russia, and families have seen their homes destroyed. Yet throughout everything, Ukraine has stood strong in the face of Russian aggression. And since day one, when I sat in the Honourable Gentleman's place opposite as Shadow Defence Secretary, this House and our country has been united for Ukraine. In opposition, Labour backed every package of military aid, every sanction on Russia, every scheme to support civilians like the Homes for Ukraine. And I know the opposition will continue to work with the government in the same way, because this House stands united for Ukraine. And Mr. Speaker, I've been proud of UK leadership on Ukraine, and I am determined that UK leadership will continue. I'm also determined to work across this House. So I will offer opposition leaders regular intelligence assessments on the conflict. I will offer MPs of all parties regular MOD and FCDO briefings. The second one, in which took place this morning within MOD, and now more than 100 colleagues from all sides of the House have attended. And Mr. Speaker, the House will receive regular updates on the conflict from me. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine is a first-order priority for me as Defence Secretary and for this new government. That's why on the second day in the job, I flew to Odessa and I joined President Zelensky and his team for the afternoon. I told him, the Ukrainians' courage inspires the world. I also told him that at this critical moment, this new government would step up our support for Ukraine. So in our first week, we announced a new package of UK military support, including ammunition, missiles, artillery guns, a new commitment to speed up the deliveries pledged by the previous government, and a promise to spend £3 billion a year on military support for Ukraine, this year, next year, and in every year for as long as it takes. And in the weeks since, Mr. Speaker, we've stepped up support still further. Signed a new £3.5 billion Defence Industrial Support Treaty, hit the £1 billion milestone for the International Fund for Ukraine, advanced the UK-led maritime and drone capability coalitions, and agreed a new £300 million contract for artillery shells. And then on Friday, last week, at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group in Ramstein, I announced a new £160 million production contract for air defence missiles, and I also announced the UK's Operation Interflex, which has trained 45,000 Ukrainian troops since 2022, will extend beyond this year and throughout 2025. This support is both short-term and long-term, immediate provision and long-term production, training troops today and developing Ukrainian forces for the future. This approach gives the Ukrainians confidence to plan, and it sends a signal to Putin that we, the UK and our allies, will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, there have been important battlefield developments during the past month. In the first week of August, Ukrainian forces launched a remarkable offensive across Russia's border into the Kursk region. This exposed the vulnerabilities of Putin's frontline forces, and it demonstrates Ukraine's ability to achieve surprise strategic attacks. It also helps better defend Ukraine and its northern centres by pushing back the sites from which Russia can launch deadly attacks. So around 900 square kilometres of territory is now held by Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. This has put Putin under pressure. And after initial disarray, Russian forces are now deploying to the area in greater numbers. But eastern Ukraine continues to be Russia's main focus, with tactical advances being Petrovsk within approximately 8 kilometres now of the front line. And with Russia continuing to rely on infantry-led assaults, its casualties remain high and rising. So daily casualties have doubled from this time last year, with Russia averaging more than 1,100 a day killed or wounded in July and August alone. Meanwhile, recent Russian air bombardments have been some of the most intense since the start of the war. President Zelensky stated on Friday in Ramstein that 4,000 missiles and drones were fired at Ukraine in the last month, targeting critical national infrastructure, attacking civilian centres, including Poltava and Lviv, in the last week. Since 2022, the impact of this has been that Russia has destroyed or it has captured more than 50% of Ukraine's power generation capacity, forcing Ukraine to implement power outages with winter approaching. Meanwhile, at sea, Ukraine has scored some significant successes, driving Russia's fleet out of the Western Black Sea to reopen export trading routes, destroying or damaging 26 Russian naval vessels operating in the Black Sea, including a Russian Kilo-class submarine just last month. Despite these notable achievements, Russian pressure across the whole of the front line will continue in the months ahead. Russian industry remains on a war footing. Russian artillery is outfiring Ukraine by at least 3-1. And Russia is also conscripting or recruiting 400,000 additional soldiers this year. So for the coming weeks, two things are clear. Ukrainians need to strengthen their front line in the east, and they will look to hold the territory in Kursk. The longer they hold Kursk, the weaker Putin becomes. The longer they hold Kursk, the better defended Ukraine will be. This was discussed at the US-led Ukraine Defence Contact Group last Friday that I attended with other defence ministers and President Zelensky. It was where military support and unity for Ukraine was strengthened among 50 allied nations, and where the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin served an important reminder to everyone. If Ukraine is not free, he said, the world is not safe. And that's why the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. And if President Putin prevails in Ukraine, he will not stop at Ukraine. If big nations redraw international boundaries by force, the sovereignty and security of all nations is undermined. That's why UK support, alongside allies, is so important. Military, economic, industrial, diplomatic support. And Mr. Speaker, I also want this House to know we are seeing clear, growing signs of Russian aggression beyond Ukraine. NATO allies are reporting Russian drones violating their airspace. The heads of the UK and US security services confirmed that Russian intelligence is, as they said, conducting a reckless campaign of sabotage across Europe. And last week, the National Cyber Security Centre revealed that Russia's specialist GRU unit is conducting offensive cyber operations directed at governments and at civilian infrastructure. Putin is targeting our security. He is targeting our way of life. We face a decade of growing Russian aggression, but this is a government that will protect our people and our country. We will actively deter and defend against Russian threats, working in partnership with allies. And that's why, as a new government, our defence policy will now be NATO first. Mr. Speaker, as we approach 1,000 days of war, this conflict is at a critical moment. That's why the UK is stepping up support, because this isn't just Ukraine's struggle, it's our struggle too. Ukraine is fighting to regain its sovereign territory, but it's also fighting to reinforce peace, democracy and security in the rest of Europe.
To the Secretary of State, James Cartlidge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for early sight of his statement, and if I may say, for the briefings he has provided to myself and to all parliamentary colleagues. We're very grateful. And in particular, I would like to associate myself and our party with the condolences expressed regarding the tragic death of Lieutenant Lation. As we have confirmed previously, I reiterate without reservation that as the government did when they were in opposition, we will continue to do everything possible to support them in supporting Ukraine. We remain steadfast in both our total condemnation of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and his conduct of the war since, with no regard to human life, even, it would appear, that of his own service personnel, with losses now at terrible levels on all sides. Indeed, in one of the most striking points made by the Secretary of State on the operational situation, Mr. Speaker, it is an extraordinary testament to the brutal disposition of the Putin regime that their strategy continues to rely on mass sacrifice of infantry personnel. That said, he is surely right to remind us that despite the extraordinary naval success Ukraine has enjoyed in the Black Sea, and the surprise incursion into Kursk that they implemented, throwing Putin's regime into confusion, nevertheless, Russia remains a formidable foe, and nothing at all can be taken for granted. On the contrary, it is clear that the UK must continue to do all it can to support Ukraine's government, people and armed forces. On this side, we are proud of the role that our government played in showing real leadership in respect of Ukraine. If Ukraine had fallen early, the world would have been in a precipice situation akin to the late 1930s. But we made a huge difference to avoiding that outcome by being the first nation to train Ukrainian troops, the first to provide main battle tanks, and in particular, the first to provide long-range weapons. Now, Mr. Speaker, in August, President Zelensky commented that Britain's support for Ukraine had slowed down recently. I wonder what assessment the Secretary of State has made of those comments. On these benches, we recognise that a key part of our leadership has been bringing other allies on board, and that must continue in key operational and logistical decision-making. Nevertheless, we have also shown leadership as a sovereign nation that believes wholeheartedly in Ukraine's fight for freedom. As such, to confirm, Mr. Speaker, we would have no hesitation in supporting the government in continuing that leadership were they to confirm to the Ukrainian government that they have maximum freedom of operation with regard to all the munitions we have supplied, including long-range missiles. On provision of additional munitions and the latest news the Secretary of State shared, I welcome the announcement in respect of £160 million for air defence missiles produced, of course, in Belfast. This underlies the intention we had in government when the latest round of support was commencing to ensure a maximum degree of benefit for the UK defence sector in our support for Ukraine. Can the Secretary of State confirm that remains a top priority, and specifically on drones, that as we supply Ukraine with more and more drones across defence, that he will ensure we learn the lessons of their deployment rapidly so that we can build the ecosystem for our own sovereign uncrewed sector? And turning to the replenishment of our own armed forces, we agree that supplying Ukraine with arms has been absolutely the right thing to do. But, and the public feel this very strongly, this must be accompanied by the replenishment of our own stockpiles and platform inventory. A top priority of our funded timetable commitment to 2.5% was an additional £10 billion to replenish our munitions. Is he still committed to that extra £10 billion for munitions? And can he confirm that the delay in setting out a clear timetable to 2.5% will not lead to the deferment of any major munitions orders either this financial year or the next one? After all, Mr. Speaker, he spoke of Russian artillery outfiring Ukraine by 3-1, and he knows the crucial importance of industrial output. That being so, Does he recognise that we must urgently fire up the production across our own defence sector by committing to 2.5% as soon as possible? Finally, Mr. Speaker, one lesson from Ukraine is the vital importance of maintaining air superiority in battle. In relation to our future air combat air capability, 6th generation GCAP, I asked Secretary of State a set of written questions on the 29th of July on GCAP spending, and he has to date only answered those on historic spend, not on the current financial year. So can he therefore confirm if his department will be deferring any spending on GCAP planned for the current financial year? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for his support, for his tone, and for his commitment to continue to back further military aid to Ukraine, including the £160 million contract for LMM missiles I've announced last week. He talks about the mass sacrifice of Russian personnel, and he's right. President Putin is a leader that shows contempt for the lives of his own soldiers. On UK leadership, I've set out to the House not just my determination to maintain the UK's leadership in support for Ukraine, but demonstrated how we have stepped that up in the first week, in the weeks that followed, and last week at Ramstein. And in terms of the lessons for drones and the deployment and our work with Ukraine, yes, we are learning those lessons. We need to speed that up. He, in his previous job, will be well aware of the implications for the way that we, in particular, consider the way we procure and contract for capabilities, both for export and for our own stockpiles. And on stockpiles, we have, as he will also know, so far spent £1 billion in the UK on replenishment. We have plans, therefore, to build on that, because we need to not just boost production, but we need to boost the productive capacity of our UK industry, so that we are capable of demonstrating, if that must be scaled up in the face of threats in the future, we can do that in a way that is not apparent at present. He asks about the question of long-range fires and long-range missiles. I have to say to him, only Putin benefits from an open debate about these sensitive issues, and I will not comment on operational discussions, but there has been no change in the UK's position. We continue to provide military aid to Ukraine, as I've set out, to support their clear right to self-defence and in line with the operation of international humanitarian law. And just finally, on this question of 2.5%, we will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. The last time the UK spent 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010, when I last stood at this dispatch box as part of the last Labour government. In 2010, the Conservatives cut defence spending. They never matched 2.5% in any of the 14 years that they were in office. And let me finish by this. My priority will always be to ensure that this country is well defended. And to face the growing threats, we will do more to make Britain secure at home and strong abroad.
Derek Twigg.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and, of course, the cast iron commitment, 100% commitment to supporting Ukraine, as we've seen previously. Can I just inquire into a bit more detail about something he said? And I do welcome his statements about the missile defence and the investments we're going to make in that. Could he say a bit more about that in terms of the scope of that?
Yes, I can, Mr. Speaker. I've met, when I say my first order priority is Ukraine, and I was in Odessa on the second day in the job, I've now had the privilege to meet President Zelensky 4 times in this post. I've met with his defence minister 6 times. And consistently, like the last government, we are trying to respond to the needs that Ukraine says it has for the systems and ammunition that it needs. It said above all, at present, they need new supplies of ammunition and they need stronger air defence systems. capable of taking down Russian missiles and drones at different distances. And so while the US at Ramstein last week made a commitment to an extra $250 million in dollars in air defence systems, we made the commitment of an extra $160 million in short-range, modern anti-defence systems, 650 LMM missiles under that new contract, with production underway, the first of which will be delivered into Ukraine before the end of the year, stepping up support that we pledge for Ukraine, speeding up the support that we deliver to Ukraine.
Now come to Liberal Democratic spokesperson, Richard Foord.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to add for the Liberal Democrats to the tributes that others have paid to Lieutenant Rodri Lechon. He served with the Commando Helicopter Force in 846 Naval Air Squadron at Yeovilton. The Royal Navy said that Rodri was one of their most trusted and highly capable aircraft captains and instructors, and our thoughts are with his family. But it reminds us of the saying, train hard, fight easy. It is attributed to the 18th century Russian commander Field Marshal Suvorov, but the Russians are not practicing that today as they send to the front Russians who've had as little as 2 weeks' training. By contrast, the training that has been provided under Operation Interflex has enabled Ukrainian troops to hold ground and to exploit Russian weaknesses. We in the Liberal Democrats welcome the announcement last week at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group that Operation Interflex will continue until the end of 2025. Indeed, we've welcomed announcements on Ukraine from both sides of this House, both from the current government but also from the previous government, and we would not want to see any party political capital sought from the solid British support for Ukraine. But we have seen some failures of the British state in recent years to plan for contingencies, whether it was post-invasion planning for Iraq or planning for a non-flu-like pandemic. We've discovered that sometimes in the British state there is a little bit of hope for the best. And I come then finally to thinking about support for Ukraine by the United States. My question for the Secretary of State is, what contingency planning is being undertaken for an uplift in our support for Ukraine and that by other states in the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, in the event that a gap opens up if we were to see a US administration under Trump and Vance?
Well, first of all, I'm sure Lieutenant Lechon's family will appreciate the Honourable Gentleman's comments in the House this afternoon. Second, the outcome of the US presidential election will be determined by the American people. And this is a country that has a deep relationship with the US. They are our most important security ally. We are their most important intelligence ally. And that is a relationship that goes back decades and has survived the ups and downs of the political cycles on both sides of the Atlantic, and we're determined that it will do again, whatever the result of the election. On the question of training, I can't match the Honourable Gentleman for his citing of 18th century military figures, but I can say to him the mismatch between the level of training that we are trying to help provide with allies to the Ukrainian troops is part of the way of countering the outmatch in numbers on the Russian side. And I can confirm to the House as well, Mr. Speaker, it isn't just the 45,000 Ukrainian troops trained so far under the Interflex operation since Putin's invasion. It is also the 93 F-16 pilots trained in English, technical matters as well as flying, and it is almost 1,000 Ukrainian Marines also trained by the UK working with allies. That's why the announcement I was able to make last week at Ramstein, that this important UK training effort linked into the new NATO arrangements will be part of the way that we equip Ukraine for the future and try and equip its forces to be better prepared and better trained than the Russian adversaries that they face.
Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let's not be under any illusion. In the face of Russian aggression and invasion, the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. I think the Defence Secretary was right to focus not only on the immediate challenges facing Ukraine, but on the longer-term imperatives. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the UK-Ukraine friendship is not just for the short term, it's not just for as long as it takes, but must endure in the years and decades to come?
I do indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. A lot of the attention is given to military aid to support the short-term needs that Ukraine have, the immediate battlefield requirements that they have. But longer term, we need to reinforce their capacity to produce for themselves, which is why an important element of the steps that we've taken to step up support for Ukraine since the election just 2 months ago has been to sign a defence export treaty, which I was privileged to sign with Defence Minister Umarov in number 10 Downing Street. £3.5 billion worth of export credit guarantees that will help us do more to get the equipment Ukraine needs manufactured and exported and into Ukrainian hands for their fight against Putin's invasion.
Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his statement today. We're seeing in Ukraine the great challenges that the people of that country are facing, and we're seeing how much resource Russia is throwing at it. And I think most colleagues on this side of the House feel it is time for Storm Shadow to be allowed to be used with freedom by the Ukrainian people. Can the Right Honourable Gentleman set out what are the legal restrictions that is stopping that from happening? Because there's been very conflicting briefing coming out of government.
This is not a matter that I'm prepared to discuss openly. I believe that such a debate benefits Putin. The principle on which this country has given and will continue to give weapons to Ukraine is that it is to support their defence, their right to self-defence as a sovereign nation, and to do so across the board does not preclude them striking targets in Russia if they're part of that determination and strategy for self-defence, and provided it's within the bounds of international humanitarian law.
Blair McDougall.
Without wishing to, for 1 second, diminish the threat of Putin's Russia or the sacrifices that Ukrainians continue to make, I note that this morning Moscow's airport was closed by Ukrainian drone attacks, that on Friday they'll be raising interest rates to 18% in the Russian central bank, that 500,000 of their troops have been killed, and all of this has been inflicted by a country that is a third of the size of Russia. And I wonder if he shares my frustration at times that so many in the West seem to accept in this information war Putin's version of events, that this war is going swimmingly for him, when in any rational assessment of this, the last 2.5 years have been an absolute catastrophe for Russia.
Well, my honourable friend is right. Part of the battle that Putin is waging is with his own people to control their freedoms, including taking steps of assassinating political opponents and controlling their right and freedom of information. And one of the things that has put President Putin under pressure as Ukraine have taken the 900 square kilometres of territory in the Kursk region to defend their own cities and centres in the north, is that it is bringing home to President Putin and to the Russian people the consequences of his aggression. So this is not a special operation simply confined to Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to self-defence, and in doing so, it is trying to defend itself better by striking targets in Russia from which They are launching the deadly attacks that Ukrainian civilians and cities and power systems have suffered for too long now.
Andrew Murrison.
What assessment has the Defence Secretary made of Operation Renovator, and how does he plan to change it?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman asks the question with a good deal more information than the rest of the House. I will write to him with the detail that he seeks, rather than try and give a superficial answer at the dispatch box this afternoon.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement, and especially what he said about a deepening military and industrial strategy between the United Kingdom and Ukraine. There is clearly a growing alliance building between Russia and Iran, one that is united on undermining democracy and certainly risks further proxy wars. Could the Defence Secretary give his assessment and how the UK government seeks to influence Iran?
Well, my honourable friend follows these matters very closely and speaks with authority in the House on these things. We have been warning, and in fact the previous government were warning too, about the deepening security alliance between Iran and Russia. And that's why, alongside the international partners at the NATO summit, part of the declaration from that summit in Washington was to warn Iran that any transfer, not just of drone technology, but particularly of ballistic missile technology to Russia, would be regarded as a significant escalation at the time. And I think this House can take a broader lesson from the Honourable Gentleman's point and what we see, which is that Iran's destabilisation is not a malign influence that is simply felt throughout parts of the Middle East. It has wider repercussions, which is why it is one of our most serious threats to this country in the future.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State can look forward to the same support from the SNP as they helped with Ukraine's defence as the previous government did. To that end, he mentioned increased air defences coming from the UK and the United States that will be there before the end of the year. Russia won't wait till the end of the year before attacking civilian infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure. Can the Secretary of State advise of any steps that have been taken to accelerate that increased air defence to the benefit of the people of Ukraine?
Yes, indeed. First of all, I'm grateful for the Honourable Gentleman's continuing commitment of support to stand with Ukraine in this House, and on his behalf and on his party's behalf. One of the things that the Ukrainians have been saying for some months is they want to see the pledges of military aid to help with their fight against this illegal full-scale invasion. But they want the delivery of what's promised to be in their hands. And that was why I made a point on day 2 in this job, when I first met President Zelensky as Defence Minister, not just to say to him, right, this is a government that is willing to step up the support we're offering, but it's a government that recognises that imperative, and we will speed up the support that we offer too. Speed up the support that the previous government, a big package of aid announced in April, would be delivered, and also to try and look to say, where we pledge our support, we will give you a guarantee about the delivery times by which it will be in your hands to strengthen your fight for your sovereignty and against this illegal invasion.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I strongly welcome the confirmation of the extension of Operation Interflex over this year and next. Will the Secretary of State join with me in paying tribute to the hard work and professionalism of the UK troops involved in Operation Interflex and the bravery of all Ukrainian troops who are serving to protect their home?
Madam Deputy Speaker, what, if I may say so, an important point to remind the House. Numbers are one thing, and when we say, as the UK, we've led the Interflex nations to train 45,000 Ukrainian troops, this is the expertise of British and other allied soldiers helping with combat medical skills, battlefield training and survival techniques. And it is dealing with Ukrainians who are stepping forward to help defend their country. I had the privilege not just of joining the then leader of the opposition on Salisbury Plain to witness some of this training, but later to talk with some of the Ukrainian troops who finished a further wave at Brize Norton as they were poised to fly back to Ukraine. These were men very much like anyone in this house. These were lorry drivers, they were accountants, they were PR executives who now are, alongside their civilian colleagues, fighting for the very future of their country, the right to decide as a sovereign nation their future in the world. And I pay tribute to their bravery. I pay tribute also to the skill of our armed forces in helping train them for that task.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We've had Suvorov. Napoleon famously said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. After 2.5 years of a barbaric Russian invasion, we cannot expect the Ukrainians to keep resisting with one hand tied behind their back. That means, whilst the Russians attack power stations with long-range missiles at will, with winter coming, whilst they use glide bombs, which are brutally effective, as tactical weapons on the front line, we have to allow the Ukrainians full freedom of action to retaliate, not just as military necessity, but to maintain their own morale. They must be bolstered to keep going. We could help them. It's about time we did that one thing.
The honourable gentleman makes his very strong points in his customary way. This is not about retaliation, it's about self-defence. And he's quite right to say that the impact of the moral is often outweighs the impact of the physical. And I talked and updated the House on the physical, the 900 square kilometres of the Kursk region that is now in Ukrainian hands. The moral or the morale impact on Ukrainian troops, on Ukrainian citizens, has been huge. So just as it's putting pressure on Putin, it is also lifting the spirits of Ukraine after nearly 1,000 days of a bloody battle against Putin's invasion.
Alan Gremmel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State spent the last Sunday of the election campaign in Prestwick, near our town's World War II Polish War Memorial. Within days, he was in Odessa and has stepped up and sped up the support the UK is delivering. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that we have started as we mean to go on, and that this government will stand up with Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do indeed. And if I may just say to my honourable friend, it's a real pleasure to see him here. He brings expertise from a very wide field of foreign policy affairs. I know he's going to make a big contribution to this House. And if I made a small contribution to his election campaign, then I'm doubly pleased to see it.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State was a consistent supporter of Ukraine in opposition, so it's no surprise to hear that positive statement from him today. When he goes into battle for a good defence budget with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will he remind her that in the 1980s and the Cold War we regularly spent 4.5% to 5.1% of GDP on defence? And will he also assure the House that if America elects a president who does not wish to support Ukraine, the support for Ukraine by the remaining European members of NATO will intensify, not diminish?
So when, as a government, we declare that we are ready and we show we are stepping up support for Ukraine, when we say we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to prevail, we mean it. Whatever the decisions of other countries may or may not be. I absolutely don't expect, whatever the result of the US elections, for the US to walk away from Ukraine. I said in my statement that if big countries with authoritarian rulers can redraw international boundaries by force, no nation's sovereignty and security is left weakened by that. And on the question of defence spending, we're a government that won't be having battles, as he put it, but in the discussions that inevitably I will have with the Chancellor, I will go into those discussions with a copy of our Labour manifesto, which at the election said that we are a government that will spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. We will increase spending on defence, which is entirely the opposite when we had the change of government in 2010, when that was a government that cut defence spending over those first 5 years by nearly 20%.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, but also to ministers for the cross-party briefings that have been provided to colleagues. They really are appreciated. President Zelensky has called on partners to ensure that aid packages which are announced are delivered to Ukrainians as quickly as possible. Can the Secretary of State set out the actions the government is taking to ensure aid to Ukraine is sped up?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is quite right. Stepping up the pledges of aid is one thing, speeding up the deliveries is another, and that's why on that second day in Odessa, with the Defence Minister and with President Zelensky, I made an undertaking that this was a government that would do both, and I'm able to update the Defence Minister in Ukraine of progress on each of the elements of the package that we have pledged.
Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his statement, and even though he has announced nothing new today, I very much welcome that he's keeping this at the top of his agenda and at the top of the nation's agenda. But while he himself may be able to say little about it, will he forgive us, those of us who can speak, for continuing to press for the West to untie the hands of our Ukrainian allies so that they can strike back at those who are striking at them illegally and without justification? Because we know it's allies, and probably not this government, but will he confirm that there are discussions with our allies about this matter? And can I wish him every success in helping us deliver the freedom and security of the world by breaking this stalemate that in Ukraine will overwhelm the West if we allow it to continue.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his comments and his welcome to me. I note the points that he makes, and I just say to him, in terms of not announcing anything new, I did so on Friday last week. This is really my first opportunity to be able to update the House, not just on the announcements of extra aid last week, but also in the weeks over the summer recess, and indeed that first week package as well. This is the fourth sitting week since the election, and I hope he'll be reassured by my personal undertaking that I will ensure that this House is updated by me on developments in Ukraine on a regular basis.
Gavin Bonavia.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd also welcome the Secretary of State's statement today and his wholehearted commitment of this country to the defence of our ally in its hour of need in the face of Putin's aggression. I'm very pleased that my constituency of Stevenage is where many of the Storm Shadow missiles that are being shipped to Ukraine are manufactured. But of course, manufacturing missiles and other armaments takes time. Can the Secretary of State explain what steps he and his department can take to speed up that process?
I will indeed, and I'm delighted to see my honourable friend in his place on this side as part of a Labour government. Speaking up for Stevenage, it's home to some of the most important, not just production of defence equipment, but also the development and the technology that goes into their development. So I say to my honourable friend, we will build actually, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, on some of the steps that the honourable gentleman first took as Defence Procurement Minister in the last months of the last government, recognising that with the nature of warfare changing so rapidly, exemplified by what we see in Ukraine, then simply large platforms that may take many years to produce so rapidly risk being outdated in the technology and the systems that they cover. We have to be able to procure, we have to be able to develop as we procure, and once in the field, we have to be able to update on a regular basis. So my honourable friend must take from that, this isn't just a question of better value for money, this is a question of better speed and clearer decision-taking in everything that we do, and that will be a hallmark of the way that we develop our procurement reforms and the way that we develop a new industrial strategy driven to try and reinforce growth in this country as part of the success of this government.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I congratulate and welcome the Defence Secretary and his ministers to their place. It is right that the UK stands with Ukraine to protect the lives and freedoms of the innocent people and the sovereignty of a free state. In addition to the military support provided, will the Secretary of State update the House on what diplomatic efforts are being carried out to negotiate an end to the Russian aggression and a full withdrawal from Ukraine and a return to a peaceful coexistence as soon as possible?
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just would say to the honourable gentleman, it's the Ukrainians that are fighting, not us. It's the Ukrainians that make the call about when to stop fighting and when to start talking, not us. Our task is to reinforce the Ukrainians now, to put them in the strongest possible position if and when they make that decision, and then to put them in the strongest possible position if they do go into negotiations.
Graham Downey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for his statement. One of the key features linked throughout the statement, and indeed the discussion today, has been the importance of consensus and cooperation and building a coalition. Can I ask the Secretary of State for an update on what steps he intends to take next to make sure that we are supporting Ukraine with the broadest and best coalition possible?
Indeed, I thank my honourable friend for that. It was my first time at the Ramstein meeting on Friday last week. It was the 24th such meeting that, of that coalition led by the US, but with the participation on Friday of senior representatives from 50 other countries, all pledging both more military support for Ukraine and reinforcing the unity with which we can stand with Ukraine. Not just reassurance, I hope, for Ukrainians, but a signal, I hope, to President Putin that we remain united, we remain resolute, and in the end, he will not prevail.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the Secretary of State's statement, and he's quite right to outline the threats that Russia is now facing onto NATO territory. Last week, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly was in Alaska looking at the missile intercept system, part of which is done through our air filing dales. But the UK and most of Europe is not protected by a missile intercept system. So may I ask the right honourable gentleman, in relation to the comments he's made in the threat that Russia's making, that as we move into the strategic defence review, that a NATO-led missile intercept system is something he is able to discuss, because it is quite a hole in the defence of Europe at this moment in time.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I grew up and went to school near RAF Fylingdales in North Yorkshire. Those big golf balls, when they were up, were a feature of the landscape for many years. I can say to my honourable friend that the Strategic Defence Review, led externally, but with the Department supporting it, has set out a set of propositions that pose some of the sort of questions that he's interested in. And I can confirm also that this is a defence review which will welcome and invite contributions from all parties, including from those who may be on the backbenches but well informed and playing roles in the wider defence and security world, not just on the front bench. So I would invite my honourable friend to consider the propositions the review has published, to consider the sort of submission that he might make as part of their deliberations, and if he can do that, we'd certainly welcome it.
Scott Harper.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement and also say that I'm proud of the role service personnel in my constituency have played in training our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And I'd also like to thank the Secretary of State for outlining the death toll in this war, Putin's brutal war. It's absolutely horrendous, and I hope that in time we will see him held to account for this and the wider damage caused by the conflict. Despite the scale of the devastation, for many in the UK this war seems like quite a distant event. That could change almost overnight if one of the many nuclear reactors in the region are damaged. I'd like to ask the Secretary of State what discussions he's had with partners about that particular issue.
Well, can I, Madam Deputy Speaker, pass on to my honourable friend our thanks and tribute to any of his constituents that were involved in the Interflex training programme to date. Can I also say to him that on the question of pursuing Putin for his war crimes, this is a government, this is a country, and a tribute to the previous government, that has been willing to help fund the Ukrainian effort to gather the evidence required to prepare potentially legal cases that allow us to bring to justice those leaders in Russia responsible for this. The Ukrainian legal authorities are currently documenting 135,000 reported alleged incidents of war crimes in their country. This is a huge job they can't do without our expertise and our support. But fundamentally, we are also now a government that in opposition made the commitment to support the setting up of a special tribunal that potentially could try President Putin for the crime of aggression.
Shalin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Secretary of State for his statement and his very clear commitment to Ukraine and its people. Everyone in this House supports exactly what the Right Honourable Member is saying, and thank him for that. With the breaking news that Ukraine has sent drones to Moscow and central Russia, it is clear that technology is very much at the forefront of this conflict. Can the Secretary of State perhaps underline the technical support that government has made available to our Ukrainian friends, and if we can be of further assistance to bring this war to an end and to allow the children, Ukrainian children, back into education and allow the families to build their lives once again? Thank you.
I'm really grateful to the honourable gentleman, because in a way he sort of prompts me to say something that I really didn't give enough emphasis to, which is this. Never mind the government support, the technology that he talks about in the hands of the Ukrainians that is playing such a decisive role is so often developed and provided by the bright people in our and other countries' industries. And I really want to say to the House, we pay tribute to all those in our British industrial and research companies who are in some cases working with the government, in some cases working under contract to the Ukrainians to provide them with what they need to win this fight, to protect their country's future and regain their territorial integrity.
Final question, Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for the early opportunities he has provided for all MPs from all parties to be briefed on the ongoing situation within Ukraine. Can I welcome this and his this government and his personal commitment to keeping members of this House regularly updated on this issue? Can I ask that he ensures that the lessons identified from Ukraine, in particular those of the formations and structures that are allowing the Ukrainian forces to be so effective, are fed into the SDR?
Yes, indeed, Madam Speaker. And can I say to him, someone who served until very close to the last general election in a very distinguished and senior capacity in our forces, can I say to him, like I did to the honourable gentleman for, is it Elmet still? The honourable gentleman for Elmet? Elmet and Rothwell? The defence reviewers will welcome contributions from this House from all sides, particularly where members of this House who do have such deep expertise are willing to make that available. And finally, appreciate his welcome of this early statement and just say to him, it will not be the last.